The question of vocation is a question that resonates with my undergraduate students, men and women who are at a stage in their lives, and frankly in the privileged position to be able to be asking a lot about what they're going to do with their lives. And that question, what am I going to do with my life, as difficult as it is significantly complicated by, for many of them, a growing recognition of all that is wrong with the world. So in our introductory theology class, one of the things I try and do is take up and wake up for these students issues of social justice and ethical significance, right? We talk about all kinds of problems: war, genocide, racism, climate change, consumerism, gross economic inequalities, cultural marginalization, sexual violence, death-dealing hunger. Not all on the first day. But we raise these questions, we raise these issues, and then my students ask me a very fair question. What am I supposed to do about it? What does all of this mean for me? This is a question of discernment. How am I going to respond? The question at the heart of all of this talk about vocation is, what does God's call mean for me? And I think of that great line from the poet Mary Oliver at the end of her poem, The Summer's Day, right? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? This morning, I'd like to turn our attention from how we think about the concept of vocation to how we encourage discernment. Ultimately, and if you want, now we've moved on to the green handout, the green outline, and you'll see sort of the way I'm trying to frame this. The way I want to talk about discernment is, to me it seems, discernment is about becoming free to be me. Okay? And so my remarks have two parts, and then there's sort of a brief conclusion on the second side of the sheet. But I'll take it up first. We'll talk about me. Not me, but me. And then we'll spend most of our time on the kicker, which is becoming free to be me. One of my complaints about the official Catholic consensus on vocation is the way in which our tradition tends to talk about vocation or adopt a generally deductive approach. I alluded to this last time. And I think Lauren captured it really well yesterday when she talked about her coming into the question of vocation not as a sense of having these boxes to check, right? That sometimes our church documents and way of talking about vocation sort of lays out a variety of vocation, and we're all happy that we sort of expanded it, but often envisions them as a state of life, or even taking the states of life as particular molds into which we're expected to fit. Do I fit into marriage? Do I fit into the single life? Do I fit into a particular career or a particular type of ministry? And I think Melissa helped us to see the ways in which is that we kind of imagine vocation in those ways. Those are real commitments. I'm not denigrating that or questioning that, but how do we kind of enter into that, and how do what I think some of the greatest saints of our tradition and individuals like Lauren and Melissa show us is that the question of vocation for individuals, for each of us, is not so often approached deductively, but more inductively, right? If you take, for example, Ignatius of Loyola, right? He believed that people don't usually march through theory towards a vocation, right? For Ignatius, we discover our call in the face of a concrete choice, a personal decision, the everyday living out of life. The universal call to holiness is not this sort of checklist run off and handed out to each of us with our baptismal certificate. It's not a generic cookie-cutter program. Rather, God extends God's call to a person. It is a personal vocation, an invitation to love in a way that has never been seen before and will never be seen again. To love in a way that only you, only I, only each of us can love. And all that draws us into the realm of discernment. So in the discussion period that'll follow my remarks this morning, we'll have an opportunity, each of us, to share the particular practices of discernment and I hope sharing the kind of rich diversity of traditions of discernment that flow out of the various religious communities and other experiences represented here. So I look forward to that conversation a lot, and when we gather back to the big group, I'm looking forward to that. But in anticipation of that, let me just share an observation from my own perspective on this whole question of discernment and me. Because it seems to me that every healthy theology and spirituality of discernment that I have yet encountered comes back to a fundamental theological conviction, namely that the God who made us saves us. The God who made us saves us. Many of you in the room know that one of the most difficult heresies the church encountered at the very beginning was that promoted by a guy by the name of Marcion, right? Who, when he read the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and he read the New Testament, shaped by a kind of a Greek dualism, he said that this God of justice of the Old Testament seems so different from the God of mercy of the New Testament that they must be different gods. Okay? And so he concluded that there's a bad creator God and a good saving God, and ended up chucking the Old Testament, a lot of the New Testament too, and sort of promoting this God of Jesus that saves us from the creator God or the God of the world. The church obviously rejected that view, and in doing so, maintained the Hebrew Bible as sacred scripture, affirmed Christianity's continuity with the covenant made with Israel, and made a very important claim about the created world, right? That the world is good and created by a loving God. Christ didn't come to reject the world or to reject us, but to bring it and to bring us to that perfection intended from the beginning. St. Thomas Aquinas is very famous for this line, grace perfects nature. Right? And by that he didn't mean grace steps in and fixes everything that's broken, but that grace brings nature to its full destiny. Right? That God's saving plan is not a radical reversal of God's plan in making us. To be saved, we reject sin, but we don't need to reject who we are. And so the key that kind of pushes us towards is that we ought to be able to learn who we are and who we ought to be based on the way in which we're made, our personality, our abilities, our interests. None of this is surprising to you. A more recent kind of articulation of this 20th century voice, Thomas Merton, in a wonderful essay, very short essay called Things in Their Identity. It's from his collection, Seeds of Contemplation. Beautiful essay, one of the best, I tell my students, essays, theological essays in the English language. It's only about 4 pages long, and it's an essay that begins with the phrase, "A tree gives glory to God, first of all, by being a tree." Okay? And Merton goes on in this essay, it's worth hearing some of his words. "The forms and individual characters of living and growing things, and of inanimate things, and of animals and flowers and all nature constitute their holiness in the sight of God. Their inscape is their sanctity. The special clumsy beauty of this particular colt on this April day in this field under these clouds is a holiness consecrated to God by his own art, and it declares the glory of God. The pale flowers of the dogwood outside this window are saints. The little yellow flowers that nobody notices on the edge of the road are saints looking up into the face of God." Right? This guy could write. And he continues on for a few paragraphs reflecting on God's special care for particularity. Right? God doesn't create green. God creates that incredible display that you see when you look out on the lawn on a spring morning, right? He goes on and writes, quote, "This leaf has its own texture and its own pattern of veins and its own holy shape. And the bass and trout hiding in the deep pools of the river are canonized by their beauty and their strength. But the great, gashed, half-naked mountain is another of God's saints. There is no other like it. It is alone in its own character. Nothing else in the world ever did or ever will imitate God in quite the same way, and that is its sanctity." So he's pointing towards what I would call, when I'm talking about an inductive approach to vocation, that it begins with God's special care for particularity in the way in which God creates each of us as we are. It reminds me, when I read this essay, it reminds me of a scene from the old movie Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. It's Kevin Costner, goes back. Anybody see that movie? Remember that movie? You don't have to admit it. It's not a very good movie. But there's a very good scene in it in which Morgan Freeman, who plays a Moor from Africa that Robin Hood has brought back to medieval England, and his character, Morgan Freeman, encounters this little English boy who's never seen a black person before. He's never seen a Moor. And the little boy quite innocently asked Morgan Freeman, "Why is your skin so dark?" And Morgan Freeman replies in a way that only he can, right? He said, "Because God loves our wondrous diversity," right? God loves our wondrous diversity. How true that is. How else would we explain this world in which we live, right? A world full of incredible galaxies extending out, right, at infinite speeds, galaxies, and at the same time coffee cake. I mean, it's an incredible kind of place. It's a world full of alligators and amoebas, Johann Sebastian Bach, and Miley Cyrus, right? God loves our wondrous diversity. One of the best homilies I ever heard was a homily that was given at my old high school at the baccalaureate mass. I had gone back, it was my younger sister was graduating, and I don't know how they do it where you're from, but in Lake Leelanau, Michigan, the baccalaureate mass is held Sunday morning. Commencement is later that day. The seniors, it's a small school, the seniors are all there. They come dressed in their caps and gowns, they process in at the beginning, they sit up in the front, they help with the readings, they bring up the gifts. It's a wonderful sort of day. Okay. So we're in the middle of baccalaureate mass, and Father Charlie comes down from the altar at the homily, and he stands right in front of the graduates. And we're all sitting there in the front row, cocky as hell the day of their graduation, right? With all of our, us family and friends and everybody sitting behind them, beaming with pride. And Father Charlie says, "It's such a beautiful day. It's such a happy day. There's so much today to be excited about, to be proud of, to be looking forward to. But I feel that it's my responsibility on this day to say to you graduates that your parents never wanted you." Your parents never wanted you. He said, "Now don't get me wrong. Imagine maybe your parents wanted a baby. I'm sure they wanted a healthy baby. Maybe they wanted a boy or they wanted a girl, but your parents never wanted you. Only God wanted you." And he said it again and again and pointed to each graduate in the front row. Only God wanted you. Only God wanted you. I feel like I've spent almost 20 years trying to take that seriously. Right? What does it mean to say that God wanted me? Not me without all my insecurities and inner faults, but God wanted me just as I am. Well, it begins with taking who I am seriously. Okay? In this essay, Merton continues, he says, "For me, to be a saint means to be myself. Therefore, the problem of sanctity and salvation is in fact the problem of finding out who I am and of discovering my true self. Trees and animals have no problem. God makes them what they are without consulting them, and they are perfectly satisfied. With us, it is different. God leaves us free to be whatever we like. We can be ourselves or not, as we please. But the problem is this: since God alone possesses the secret of my identity, He alone can make me who I am, or rather, He alone can make me who I will be when I at last fully begin to be. Right? My vocation is not out there apart from me. Right? My vocation is me. Right? Me. Okay? Are we doing okay so far? I think so far so good. This is a message that we've probably heard before. It's an emphasis that we are no doubt familiar with. And I imagine, too, there are a number of you in the room who have recognized already a problem with this whole scenario. Namely, I often screw things up. Right? I often confuse who God made me to be with who I want me to be. And that is the reality of sin. Theologian Dennis Doyle at the University of Dayton tells a story that I just love because it perfectly matches my own experience of sin. Okay? When I was a freshman at the University of Notre Dame, I had this profound moment of realization, a kind of aha awakening moment, into the fundamental equality of all human beings as children of God. And this is how it came to me. It was early on in my freshman year, and it was lunchtime, and I was at the South Dining Hall on the campus of Notre Dame, and I was carrying my tray of food, and I got in the food, and I'd come out into it's a huge room with kind of big oak tables and wonderful woodwork and everything, and I looked up and was at this kind of sea of students, right? All of my classmates and peers, And in that moment, I was sort of overcome with this profound insight. And this is how it came to me. Ed, in the eyes of God, you are no better than anyone here. In the eyes of God, you are no better than anyone here. It was a deep kind of realization that was almost immediately followed by a further realization, namely, that as one of the very few people who truly understood that I am no better than anyone else, I'm just slightly better than most people. That's the reality of sin. St. Augustine called it pride, right? Not pride in the sense of a healthy appreciation for one's own gifts and abilities. By pride, Augustine meant that ever-present temptation to expect the universe to revolve around me, to set myself up through decisions large and small over the course of a lifetime as master and commander of all that is. Merton calls that the false self, right? That self that wants to exist outside the radius of God's will and God's love for me. But the paradox is that nothing can exist outside the radius of God's will and God's love. And so in sin, we strangely strive for an illusion. We try and become nothing. We try to exist where there is no existence. And the best we can do in that space is wrap ourselves up in honors, in money, in experiences, in pleasures, possessions. And he uses the image, it's like an invisible man wrapping himself up in bandages, all of which comes to an end in an emptiness telling me I am a mistake, right? We can be ourselves or not, as we please. In other words, it's not just about me. It's also about becoming free from that false self, becoming free from sin, becoming free from self-centeredness in order to be the me that God always intended. So how do we open ourselves up to the voice of God? How do we learn to listen? As we move into part 2 on the handout, I'd like to sort of approach this out of my own work. And I'd like to do it continuing sort of the ecumenical approach I began yesterday. I'd like to compare and contrast two approaches. So a little bit of this is academic and theological, but I hope it's practical in the sense of that we're getting at this notion of discernment and coming to an understanding. I want to kind of contrast two major trajectories, the trajectories I started last time, one Protestant, the other Catholic. But I'd like to focus in on two guys by the name of Karl. All right? Karl Barth, the great Reformed theologian, and Karl Rahner, great Jesuit Catholic theologian. These guys, these Karls, are two theological giants of the 20th century. But they also, and so they just deserve consideration in terms of the profound effect they had both on Protestant theology and Catholic theology over the last 100 years. But they're interesting to me, and this is one of the happy discoveries I sort of made in working, that these two guys also offered two of the most significant modern treatments of the concept of vocation, working out of their two distinctive traditions. Both, in a way, were responding to the diminishment in the theology of vocation within their respective traditions. Both end up with two different ways of talking about discernment, okay? But they are first responding to kind of a lack or a diminishment. Karl Barth, so over the course, as I said last time, over the course of the modern period, the Protestant notion of vocation, the Protestant notion of calling had become reduced to the kind of secular notion of work, or the status quo of social roles. And Barth is responding to that. In Catholic treatises, vocation, as I said, was reserved to a few and spiritualized to the point of becoming otherworldly or unreal. And Rahner is responding to that. So they both respond in different ways, both try and reclaim vocation in more compelling, more relevant ways. What's interesting to me, though they'll diverge, is that both share an emphasis on this inductive approach I'm talking about. Both argued strongly that vocation has to do with a concrete particularity of the person. Did I just, okay. I was warned this might happen. Does anybody have a spare mic? Okay, can you hear me now? Good, right. You've all heard the joke about the bishop who shows up for confirmation? Yeah, okay. So the bishop arrives for confirmation, and he gets up in front of the assembly, and he says, there's a problem with this mic. And the assembly replies, and also with you. Or I'm sorry, and with your spirit. Both of these guys, Barth and Rahner, talk about vocation inductively, that they focus on the concrete particularity of the person, the individual uniqueness of each and every human subject, right? God wanted you, okay? So let me just kind of briefly summarize rather complex theological ideas here, but in a way we'll always be pushing towards discernment. Okay. As I said, Barth is concerned that the Protestant tradition of vocation had secularized the term. And his worry is that the radical nature of God's call was lost. Okay? And he begins with Luther. And he acknowledges two gains that Luther made. One, and we talked about both of these last time. One, he appreciates the broadening of vocation, that every work, every way of life can be considered a calling. Secondly, he appreciates the way in which Luther radically focused the notion on love of neighbor. Okay? Now, what comes through, Barth argues, in Luther, by talking about responding to God where you are, is a remarkable sensitivity in Luther to the concrete and contextualized nature of Christian charity. It's not abstract, it's where you're at, where you live. Okay? And although Luther wouldn't have used these words, what he was really emphasizing was the particularity of one's historical and social location as the inescapable arena within which Christian discipleship takes shape. And Barth picks up that second point and really develops it. He talks about the whole complex of particularities that constitute each of us as created beings. Right? He cites Dietrich Bonhoeffer's definition of vocation as, quote, the place of responsibility, where we respond to God, right? The terminus a quo, the point from which we respond to God. Thus, for Barth, and he sort of takes Luther and then kind of expands that notion of context. Luther is not just your state of life or your sphere of influence. It's your whole constitution and your whole context. In other words, for him, my vocation is not just my profession, it's my person. Okay? Seen as a unique creation placed by God in a particular time, at a particular place, and gifted with particular abilities, disabilities, experiences, and associations. And Barth, his language for all of this is limitation. Each of us has a unique existence that's determined by the very limitations imposed on us by the Creator. Right? Lauren yesterday talked about it's just as important to know what we're not called to be as it is to know what we're called to be. So the fact that God created me means that God did not mean me or does not want me to be someone else, living in some other place or in some other time. No matter how much I aspire to it, I will never be a medieval peasant or the premier of China. Okay? In our limits, we catch a glimpse of God's plan for us. And all that for Barth is good, but it doesn't go far enough, right? Because at the root of his broader critique of the Protestant tradition is his deep conviction that God's call cannot be limited to our limitations. Just because I was made a certain way doesn't mean I can't be called to something more. And the stuttering Moses comes first on a long list of biblical characters that Barth lines up to say, are we so limited by our limitations? Can't God call us beyond those limitations? And so it's interesting. Here Barth distinguishes, and I've got it on the sheet here, he distinguishes between human vocations and the divine summons. Beruf and Berufung are the German words that he uses. Okay? They're two different ways of talking about call. Human vocations are our limitations, our created context and constitution, and the divine summons. The frustrating thing is that in the English translation of Barth's Church Dogmatics, they translate those two different German terms with the same English word, vocation, and so it's confusing. You have to work to figure out what he's talking about. But for Barth, they're very different, okay? And it's this dialectical cast to the relationship between the two that determines his treatment, okay? The close association of vocation with human states of life and human occupations, for him, all risks watering down the prophetic demands of the gospel, right? Despite his speech impediment, Can't Moses lead the people Israel, right? Can't Romero leave the comfort of his chancery? Can't my students ignore the expectations of their parents and make a truly radical life decision? Are we so limited by our limitations, so confined by the circumstances and particularities of our created existence? So Barth is trying to pry open space, right, for the prophetic demand of the gospel to break through, to confront, to challenge any and all human vocations. But in the end, Barth leaves us with a kind of unresolved tension between a human vocation and the divine summons. And despite all of the time he spends attending to the particularity of the person, we're left wondering, what can we really learn from our context and constitution, right? What can spiritual direction or attention to the signs of the times in the end really tell us about what God is calling us for? Because we're always wondering and worried that God might be calling us to something more. There's that unresolved tension. And so when it comes to discernment, as great as Barth is on the concept of vocation, when it comes to discernment, you're left, he kind of concludes with this sort of casual confidence that it'll all work out, okay? That it'll all work out. Those of you who have studied 20th century theology won't be shocked to hear that Karl Rahner comes at all of this from a very different direction. And in many ways, these two Karls make a difficult comparison. They're sort of like galactic thinkers spinning around in different universes. Okay? Barth is the heir to Luther's legacy, this kind of broad and inclusive notion of calling that's occupied with external occupations and social roles. Rahner is a son of St. Ignatius. His reflections emerge out of the modern trajectory of thinking about vocation, which focused not on secular callings, but on priesthood and religious life. It was occupied not so much with the externals of social status, but more with the internal call of God found deep in the soul. Thus, they mark two distinct traditions. And the key difference, just in anticipation here, from a theological perspective, between these two traditions, sort of like my great conclusion on all of this, is that it's just as important as what they say about vocation is where they say it. The main difference between these two traditions is that for Barth, and in Protestantism in general, vocation is treated under the doctrine of creation. For Rahner and for the Catholic tradition more broadly, vocation is treated within a theology of grace. Okay? And this is what starts to move us towards discernment, right? Barth, for all his critique of Luther, Barth nevertheless follows him on this, that he treats vocation within creation, that our individual vocations follow, he wanted to say, on how each of us is made. But even as he made that claim, he cautioned against the idea of trying to deduce your calling from the facts of birth and biology, interest, or aptitude, and that sets up the tension that I talked about. Okay? Rahner approached the issue quite differently by insisting that our unique individuality flows not only from nature, but also from grace, which he understood as God's self-communication. Okay? And he used this category that a generation of theological students had to learn, the supernatural existential, which is a fancy way of saying God's gracious presence to each of us. Okay? The offer of God, of God's very self to us. And Rahner would point out that the supernatural existential, God's offer of God's self, comes not by way of a general impersonal invitation, like an announcement pinned to a bulletin board, or the always open door of a counselor's office. Right? Rather, grace comes as a specific and unique act and event of love. And that love touches, indeed constitutes us as the particular person, as a unique child of God that each of us is. It really is a love story. It really is billions and billions of unique love stories. Right? Rahner argues that each of us has a unique individuality. First, because we're material and our bodies are different. Second, because we're spiritual, our souls are different. But third, and most importantly, because each of us is a child of God through grace. Thus, our unique particularity follows not just from the fact of our creation, It flows from the unique offer of grace extended in love by God. Okay? And Rahner offered different names for this gift of God. He called it the supernatural existential, the self-communication of God, a quasi-formal cause, uncreated grace. But what he was really talking about was a relationship. God's love is what makes us special. Okay? Or as Augustine prayed so long ago, right? Lord, because you love me, I am lovable. It's that unique event of love for each of us. God not only designed me, God desired me. Okay? God loves me. And I just quote a paragraph here from Rahner. But if God's love for the individual person is thus in each case divinely unique, if his gift of himself is not something general, as though he were the same for everyone, equally accessible and universally distributed. If God's act of self-communication to the individual person is rather, in each case, a fresh, exceptional, ever-unique miracle of utterly personal love, divinely radical and divinely unique, then through this love, the beloved himself is truly someone absolutely unique. And indeed, it is indeed true that God has called each of us by name. Okay? So this emphasis on the personal relationship of God in love, it's not absent from Barth. The difference is how it factors into vocational discernment. For Rahner, my unique existence does not stand over and against the divine summons. Rather, the summons comes as the gift of God's presence that constitutes me as unique. To put it another way, if grace is the presence of God within me, that makes me the unique person, the special child of God that I am, then discernment demands an always more honest sense of myself, an always more honest discovery of who I am. It demands both a receptivity to the God who made me and an openness to the me whom God has made. And in terms of discernment, Rahner would say, we take particular decisions and we hold them up alongside my unique identity as a child of God. And what I'm looking for is resonance. Right? I'm looking for a harmony between my basic sense of myself before God and the concrete choice before me. Does the decision, and of course the Ignatian spirituality here is evident and obvious and explicit in Rahner, okay? Does the decision to, but he's transposing that early modern spirituality into the categories of modern existential philosophy and transcendental thought. Does the decision to follow this particular path preserve or deepen the kind of fundamental consolation I feel? Does it strengthen the peace that I feel when I stand openly and honestly before God? Or does it disturb the peace? Does it jar against my basic self-understanding, feel inauthentic or untrue to my relationship with God? Harmony between the two helps me know what I am called to do. However, I keep coming back to this, right? Resonance means little if the tuning fork is bent. Right? If discernment is about finding harmony between who I am as a child of God and a particular path forward, then it's crucially important to know who I am as a child of God, to have a truly open and honest sense of oneself before God. And that whole process depends on conversion. Okay? So I guess what I'm moving in obviously taking my own preference for the kind of Catholic trajectory, right, that the discernment becomes not the sudden confrontation that characterized Barth, but more the slow conversion that discipleship is meant to foster. Okay? How do we come to that true sense of ourselves? How do we come to see past the distractions and the dysfunctions of the false self to embrace the self that God always had in mind? Well, thank God we don't have to do it alone. Right? And I was moved, and I'd like to hear more from Katie's comment yesterday about encouraging this kind of fellowship, partnership, journeying, because I think that that's really essential to this discernment process. We need others. We need a communal context, a narrative, and a tradition of practices that hold us together. For as Vatican II reminds us, we are not saved and made holy as individuals without any bond between us, but rather, quote, God chose to make us into a people who might acknowledge God and serve him in holiness, right? That we are called together. And Rahner's approach presumes this, right? He would say, like, the offer of grace is a given. Okay, it's always there, extended to every human being, always in love, creating each of us. But not every person accepts this gift or sees past the distractions of the categorical to embrace the transcendental truth that constitutes our own unique truth. We don't always have an honest sense of ourselves before God. And just bear with me for a minute on this kind of Ignatian trajectory here. But in a way, he's kind of pointing back to the wisdom of the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, right? As you know, many of you know, that the exercise is a complex pattern of meditation and reflection that you could argue has as its heart the question of how do I respond to God's call. Ignatius called it the election, that decision, the choice, the individual's response to God. What's significant, and I think Rahner would acknowledge this, is that choice only comes in the second week of the exercises, this 4-week process, okay? After the purification of the affections that come in the first week, okay? In other words, authentic discernment occurs only in the context of an ongoing conversion that comes through immersion in the story of Jesus. And Ignatius was a modern individual, right? He was profoundly introspective, and even in the exercises, he warns the retreat director not to get in the way of an individual and their relationship with God. But still, it is significant that Ignatius did not write a book of personal piety. He didn't write a book meant for the individual to go off and read and reflect and find their way to God. Rather, he wrote a guidebook, which is one reason that exercises are so impossible to read, right? It's not meant to be read for spiritual edification by a retreatant. It's meant to be read by the retreat director, who uses his advice to help another person grow closer to God. So the very existence of the exercises implies something that I think our Catholic sensibility knows so well, that it takes other people to lead us to God. It takes other people to lead us to God. How do we think about that journey today? On the second half of the second side of the handout, I just have a couple of sort of concluding suggestions to help us think about the kind of conversion. I try and make the case that the kind of conversion, obviously this, each individual unique story is its own, but we all share a kind of a common context. We all live in a postmodern and deeply pained world, right? The kind of problems that we talk about with my undergraduate students, the kind of overwhelming, almost paralyzing sort of world in which we live. And I would suggest that one way forward today is that the kind of conversion, the kind of turning that's demanded of me, that's demanded of my students, demanded of each of us, is a conversion as extroversion, a kind of a turning outward, an opening up to the other, particularly the suffering other. It's one reason that I've found Francis so, not only hopeful, but just so fascinating in the way in which he has so consistently embodied and articulated this language of going out to the margins, of opening to others, of making oneself vulnerable, of not being afraid of mistakes, of engaging the other. When Rahner talks about this, the need for conversion, he comes back around to the cross of Christ. It's an important category for him. And talking about the cross in the context of discernment, we use language of indifference or openness to God. That's the Ignatius language, indifference. But openness or poverty of spirit, detachment. Rahner sees that as a participation in the death of Christ. It's interesting. He's working out of an existential sort of philosophy, and so he reads the death of Christ through the death of the subject or the self. But what if in today we read the death of Christ not through the death of the subject or of the self, but through the death of the other? Okay? The death of the other. Then the cross that we see belongs to those whom the Jesuit martyr of El Salvador, Ignacio Ellacuría, called the crucified people. Conversion finds a form of turning outward. The very first trip that Pope Francis took out of the Vatican was not to World Youth Day in Brazil. It was to this tiny island of Lampedusa. And I don't know how many of you followed that story. It was an incredible trip. The Pope got a letter from a local pastor there. Lampedusa is a small island, but it's like one of the main points of entry for immigrants, particularly from North Africa into Europe. And some estimate that as many as 10,000 or more immigrants have died trying to cross the waters to Europe. And he got a letter from a pastor describing a particularly sad story of a capsizing of a boat of immigrants in which people died. And he said in his homily that it broke his heart. And so he decided to go to Lampedusa, and he practically made the flight arrangements himself. Didn't inform the Secretary of State, took a small retinue, got there, got on a Coast Guard cutter, went out through a wreath of chrysanthemums out into the water to acknowledge. He went back to a sports arena in the town of Lampedusa and held a homily. And liturgically, I don't know if you saw the pictures, the altar that he used was made of parts of wreckage from these boats that had capsized in which immigrants had drowned. The crozier he held, the chalice he used was made from the wreckage of these ships. And he gave this incredible homily about the need to weep for those for whom no one is weeping, that need to recognize the suffering, the death of others. So it seems to me that the spirituality demanded in this world in which we live is not that of a kind of a directionless detachment, but as I call an oriented openness, a spirituality of solidarity. Martin Luther used it, I'm wrapping up here. Martin Luther used the biblical category of calling to argue that we must serve the neighbor whom we meet where we are in the daily exercise of our callings. It was a challenge to love those who are close. But we think about the trajectory that Francis is embodying, this trajectory that, of engagement that is articulated in other ways, powerful ways, by liberation theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez. Gustavo Gutierrez, over the course of his career, pointed to the story of the Good Samaritan. And it emerged, the first evidence I find of it is a small talk he gave in Peru years and years ago, kind of was sort of sparked the liberation theology movement. But it's interesting the way he meditates on the Good Samaritan, right? And he points out something that we often miss when we tell that story. The story, remember how the story begins? He gets a question from a scribe. Jesus gets a question from a scribe, because he is described as just asked, what's the most important law or something like that? Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor. And then the scribe says, and who is my neighbor? The story ends not with Jesus' answer to that question, but with another question. Okay? After he tells the story of the actions of the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan, Jesus comes back with, and who was a neighbor? Okay? So rather than point out our neighbor out there, Jesus asks, who acted as a neighbor, who became a neighbor, who crossed over to the other side of the road, who was drawn into the solidarity with the world of history's victims. Okay? So like the Samaritan, that we are called to love thy neighbor by becoming a neighbor, by drawing close to the abused and neglected one on the side of the road. And that movement towards the other embodies a spirituality of solidarity, a fundamental stance of openness that draws us into the world of history's victims. The call to a more radical life of discipleship today is not the flight from the world that marred some interpretations of the monastic life. We're not called out of a sinful world, we're called into a suffering one. And that call to solidarity can, frankly, be overwhelming. It is for me, it is for my students. And so lest that we become paralyzed by it, we should keep in mind that the call to solidarity is not the end of discernment, but the beginning. I think we so often get things backwards. We think that service, acts of charity, solidarity, a particular life of ministry, comes at the end of the discernment process. That we go through this process of discernment to decide how we're going to serve other people. What I want to suggest is that solidarity comes not at the end of the discernment process, but at the beginning. That's the great reversal I want to suggest for all of our work trying to promote vocations in the church. Following the example of Christ, we need to go out to the other in need. Following, like the Good Samaritan, we have to go over to the abused one on the side of the road. And that presence to the other helps us to understand ourselves better. It starts to free us from the delusions of the false self. Right? And through that process of discipleship, we learn how to discern. We come to see ourselves more honestly, right? So Lauren hanging out there 50 feet above the ground, trying to find language to talk to kids about God, right, was not the end result of some incredible process of discernment in which everything was clear and she made that choice. She just did it. And that helped her understand herself better, come closer and closer to that true self that Merton describes, so that she found ways to serve and to continue to serve. A wise pastor was once asked, what does it mean to be Catholic? And he responded by saying, spend the next year, 12 months, doing two things. Right? Go to Mass regularly at the same parish. And second, volunteer regularly at a soup kitchen or some other place where you can be with the poor. Do that for a year, and then you'll know what Catholicism is about. What if instead of asking, what does it mean to be Catholic, we ask, what does it mean to be me? I'd say from a Christian perspective, the answer is pretty much the same. Spend a year present to others, particularly those in need, and then you'll start to see who you are. And every good decision will flow from there. So in the end, there is no easy answer to the question, what am I to do with my life? For discernment demands conversion that is nothing less than the long and difficult path of discipleship, which is an incredibly disappointing conclusion. But that's the best I've got, the best I've come up with so far. So when I get frustrated with my own failures, when I'm confronted by my students who are so upset with the way the world is running, all I can say is keep walking. It's okay not to have it all figured out yet. Just keep walking, because that walking is the start of a transformation that, if we hold ourselves open to it, will help us to see ourselves more honestly and hear our callings more clearly. Thank you.